If you've ever trusted family so deeply that you never imagined they could become the people you needed protection from, this story is going to get under your skin. What happened to me started inside a polished, respectable home where everyone sounded calm, educated, and in control. That was exactly why it took me so long to understand how much danger my daughter and I were really in. My dad pointed a gun directly at my 4-year-old daughter's head and yelled, "Sign the loan papers, or you can watch your little girl lose the only future you think you can protect." He said that to me in my parents' study, with the door locked and the family portrait still hanging on the wall behind him, like we were some kind of perfect, respectable family. 40 minutes later, the same man who had controlled everyone in my life for years stood completely frozen when one phone call changed the entire room and made his hands start shaking. As always, before we dive into a story with an ending that's going to feel really satisfying for you, let's do a quick roll call. Type present and the city you're watching from in the comments. For everyone who has liked and subscribed, I pray that God makes your problems easier, widens your provision, and keeps your body healthy. Thank you, my friends. Now listen carefully to my story. My name is Julia Hart, and for most of my life, people described my family the same way. Solid. Respected. Sharp. My father, Richard Hart, was one of those men who could walk into a bank, a courtroom, a country club, or a charity gala and immediately make people straighten their posture. He had built a regional property financing company from almost nothing, and by the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, everyone around me acted like he had built more than a business. They acted like he had built truth itself. My mother, Helen, was softer in public, but only in the polished way expensive women sometimes are. She knew how to smile without revealing anything. She knew how to host dinners where every napkin was folded perfectly and every guest left thinking they had been warmly welcomed, even when she had already judged them from head to toe. She never raised her voice unless the doors were closed. Then she could say the cruelest things in the quietest tone. I was their only child, and from the outside that probably looked like a privilege. It wasn't. Being their daughter meant being their investment. Every school I attended, every activity I joined, every internship they approved, every friendship they tolerated, all of it had to fit the image they had built around the Hart name. I grew up understanding rules that were never fully spoken. Don't embarrass the family. Don't contradict your father in public. Don't look emotional in front of people who might one day matter. And above all, don't mistake being loved for being free. Still, I thought I understood my parents. Strict, controlling, proud, maybe emotionally cold, yes. Dangerous? No. That word would have sounded dramatic to me back then. I met my husband, Andrew Cole, when I was 28 and had already started doing legal and contract review work for one of my father's affiliated companies. Andrew was not from a weak family, and maybe that was why Dad initially liked him. Andrew was an architect, smart without being flashy, thoughtful with money, careful with words. He didn't try to charm people too hard, which made his kindness feel real. When he spoke to me, he sounded like he was talking to a person, not a role. That mattered more than I can explain. We got married after 2 years. Not quickly, not recklessly. Everything about our life looked responsible. We bought a beautiful but manageable house in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. I stepped back from full-time corporate work after our daughter, Sadie, was born, but I kept doing contract consulting from home and handled several real estate review projects for clients I had built relationships with over the years. Andrew's business grew steadily. We weren't living off my parents. That was important to him, and eventually it became important to me too. Sadie was 4 when everything broke open. She had Andrew's dark eyes and my stubborn mouth. She liked purple rain boots even when it was sunny, asked impossible questions at breakfast, and treated every stuffed animal like it had feelings that needed to be considered. She was the kind of child who made strangers smile in grocery store lines. She was also the first person in my life who made me understand fear in a physical way. Not anxiety, not stress. Fear. The kind that lives in your ribs. My parents adored her in the public way wealthy grandparents sometimes do. Expensive gifts. Photos. Perfect birthday parties. Structured affection. But even early on, there were things that bothered me. My father kept talking about legacy around her. Not in a sweet way. in a possession way. He'd sit Sadie on his knee in that huge leather chair in his study and say things like, "One day, all smart little girls need to understand who built the ground beneath their feet." Then he'd laugh like it was a joke, and everyone else in the room would laugh too. Another time, when Sadie was barely 3, she reached for a cookie before dinner at one of my parents' Sunday meals, and my mother said, "In this family, we wait until we're told." Her tone was calm, but it was the same tone she had used on me when I was 10 and stood too close to a conversation she didn't want me hearing. Sadie pulled her hand back so fast that even Andrew noticed. On the drive home, he looked at me and said, "Your mother doesn't know how to speak to children." I stared out the window and said, "She doesn't know how to speak to anyone she can't control."
Andrew glanced at me.
That wasn't a joke. I know. Then why are we pretending it was? I didn't answer him. That was one of my oldest bad habits. Silence had gotten me through childhood, and sometimes I still reached for it even when it was clearly making things worse. The first odd shift didn't come with shouting or scandal. It came wrapped in concern. One Thursday afternoon, Dad asked me to stop by his office downtown because he wanted my legal eyes on a batch of internal refinancing documents before a lender meeting. That wasn't unusual. Even after I had pulled back from full-time company work, he still occasionally used my skills when something sensitive came up. I brought Sadie with me because Andrew was at a site visit. Dad's office sat on the top floor of a glass building he loved because it reflected the skyline and made his company look bigger than it really was. His assistant, Monica, greeted me with her usual precise smile, but something about the office felt tense. Too quiet. People looked busy in that stiff way people do when they're trying not to look at something. Dad met me in the conference room with 2 men I recognized from one of his lender relationships and a financial consultant named Gregory Shaw, who had recently started appearing around several Hart financial events. Gregory was in his 50s, polished, careful, and impossible to read. He was one of those men who never seemed flustered because he had built his whole personality around being the calmest person in the room. "Julia," Dad said, getting up to kiss my
cheek.
"Thanks for coming." He barely looked at Sadie. That alone felt strange. I sat down, opened the folder he handed me, and started reading. At first it looked routine. Loan extension structures, asset-backed collateral language, cross-default clauses. Then I saw a property schedule attached to a proposed credit line and felt my stomach tighten. One of the assets referenced in the package was Cedar Hollow Holdings, a trust-linked holding entity. I knew that name. It was connected to a family estate structure my grandfather had created years before he died. He had never trusted that money should move without checks, so he had layered ownership through trusts and protective clauses that Dad used to complain about constantly. Certain pieces were under my father's influence, but not all of them. Some required joint signatures or triggered restrictions when minors' future interests were involved. I kept reading. There was language suggesting future contingent benefit routing related to a descendant line. That descendant line was Sadie. I looked up slowly. Why is this trust structure included in a commercial refinancing package? Dad leaned back. Because the lender wanted a fuller picture of available family-backed strength. That's not what this is. I turned another page. This package references contingent collateral exposure pathways tied to a beneficiary structure. One of the lender men cleared his throat. Gregory watched me carefully. Dad gave a tiny smile. "You always did love dramatic phrasing." "No," I said, keeping my voice level. "I love precise phrasing. This is not a normal summary attachment." The room went a little still. Dad tapped the table. "It's preliminary. That doesn't answer the question." Gregory finally spoke. "It may not proceed in this form." That sentence was too smooth, too prepared. I closed the folder. "Then why am I looking at it?" Dad's eyes stayed on mine. "Because I value your opinion." He said it warmly. Anyone listening casually would have heard affection. I heard measurement. Sadie, who had been coloring quietly in the corner, held up a drawing and said, "Mommy, look, I made a purple house." I turned to her, smiled, and said, "It's beautiful, baby." When I looked back, Gregory had already slid the folder slightly closer to himself, like he regretted letting it sit open in front of me too long. That night I told Andrew everything. He was at the kitchen island reviewing site photos on his laptop while I reheated leftovers. Sadie was asleep upstairs. Could it have been sloppy drafting? He asked. Not from those people. Could your father be trying to signal family strength without meaning to pull anything real? I stared at him. You've met my father. He doesn't accidentally test legal pathways around family assets. If that trust structure is being floated, he's exploring something. Andrew closed his laptop. Then you need copies. I know. You didn't take any? It happened too fast, and I didn't want to show my hand. He nodded once. Then don't show it yet. But stop assuming you're overreacting. That was the first time he said that sentence to me. I wish I had listened harder. A few days later, my mother invited us for Sunday lunch. She sounded almost sweet on the phone, which usually meant she wanted something. Andrew had to meet a contractor and said he'd join later, so I took Sadie alone. I nearly canceled 3 times before leaving the driveway, but guilt is a powerful leash when it has been tied around you since childhood. My parents' house sat behind iron gates and old maple trees, the kind of place that made delivery drivers pause before ringing the bell. Inside, everything smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive candles. Mom had set the dining room as if she were entertaining ambassadors instead of her daughter and granddaughter. She kissed Sadie's forehead, told her how pretty her dress was, then looked at me and said, "You look tired. Are you sleeping badly again?" There it was. The first little needle. "I'm fine," I said. Dad came in 5 minutes later, phone in hand, and greeted me with enough warmth that if I hadn't been in that conference room days earlier, I might have relaxed. Lunch started normally.
Soup. Bread.
A roast. My mother discussing some museum board event. Dad taking calls between bites. Sadie asking whether clouds get lonely. Then Mom put down her napkin and said almost casually, "Gregory told your father that you seemed unusually agitated in the office." I looked up. "Gregory shouldn't be discussing my tone with you." Mom shrugged. "People notice things. You've always had a tendency to personalize professional matters." Dad sipped water. "Your mother is only saying you don't need to turn every technical issue into a family betrayal." I didn't. "But you implied one," he said. I felt heat move up my neck. I asked a direct legal question about a trust structure tied to my daughter. Mom gave a tiny laugh.
There.
That tone. As if everyone is trying to steal your child. "No one said that. You didn't have to," she replied. "That was how they did it. They said the most outrageous version of your fear out loud, so they could make you sound unstable for having the smaller, more reasonable concern in the first place." Sadie looked between us and went quiet. I lowered my voice. "Can we not do this in front of her?" Dad leaned back. "Then don't start things in front of her." I almost laughed from pure disbelief. "I didn't start this." Mom folded her hands. "Julia, sweetheart, being a mother has made you overly sensitive. That can happen." I stared at her. There are moments when a sentence is so familiar that it stops sounding like language and starts sounding like architecture. I had heard versions of that sentence my whole life. You're emotional. You misread tone. You create tension. You always think there's something hidden. Overly sensitive was just the polished version they used once I became an adult. Sadie whispered, "Mommy?" I forced a smile and reached for her hand. "I'm okay, baby." Dad said, "Maybe it's time you stop taking on side contract work. You seem stretched thin." That caught my attention immediately. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. My work is not the issue." He looked at me evenly. "Your judgment is." I should have left then.
I know that now.
But growing up around intelligent manipulators teaches you to wait for clarity, and clarity almost never arrives in one dramatic moment. It comes in layers you only recognize later. After lunch, while Mom took Sadie to the garden to show her the roses, I went to the powder room down the hall near Dad's study. On my way back, I heard low voices through the half-closed study door. Dad was inside with Gregory. I stopped. Gregory was saying, "You're moving too fast. If she starts asking outside counsel questions, the structure will get attention." Dad replied, then she needs to stop asking questions. That's not a strategy. It is if pressure is applied correctly. I went cold. Gregory lowered his voice further, and I only caught pieces. The husband not fully inside if she resists alternate leverage. Then Dad said something that made my skin crawl. She is always folded when family is involved. My hand tightened around the hallway console, so hard my knuckles hurt. I moved before they could open the door and found Sadie in the garden with Mom, who was kneeling beside her explaining the names of flowers with that lovely, controlled voice she used in front of other people. On the drive home, Sadie fell asleep in her car seat with one sock half off and a cracker in her hand. I kept checking the rear-view mirror like someone might be following us, even though that felt ridiculous. When I got home, Andrew took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I told him every word. He listened without interrupting, then stood up and locked the back door, which wasn't even his normal habit during daylight. "We need to document everything." I only heard fragments. "Then write the fragments down exactly." I did. Date, time, place, who was there. Exact phrases I remembered. Andrew scanned my notes and said, "We need trust documents. Real ones, not what your father chooses to show you." I might still have copies from Grandpa's estate summary archives, where, in the storage cabinet in my office. Maybe some digital files, too. "Then tonight," he said. That night, after Sadie was asleep, I went through old estate binders and encrypted folders I hadn't opened in years. Most of it was boring administrative history. Trust amendments, property schedules, beneficiary memos, tax correspondence. Then, in an older folder marked CH-17, I found a summary memo from the law firm that had handled one phase of my grandfather's restructuring. I sat down hard in my office chair. The memo referenced a protected contingent inheritance line for my future children, one that could not be pledged, reassigned, or leveraged without court-reviewed safeguards if the beneficiary was still a minor. It also mentioned that any attempt to create indirect commercial exposure through affiliated family entities would trigger scrutiny and potentially invalidate related agreements. I read it 3 times. Dad knew this. He had to know this. I printed the memo, tucked it into a plain folder, and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Andrew came in behind me. "Well?" I held up the pages.
He's not confused.
"He's testing boundaries he knows are there." Andrew's face changed in that quiet way it did when he was angry enough to become careful. Then we stopped playing this like a family misunderstanding. I looked toward the hallway where Sadie slept. And for the first time in my life, I thought something that frightened me even more than the documents. Something is not right here. The next few weeks were a slow tightening, the kind that can make you doubt yourself because there's no single dramatic event to point to. It was phone calls at odd hours, invitations that felt like summons, questions about our finances that came disguised as concern. My mother asking whether Andrew's latest project was stable enough for this economy. My father asking whether we had considered consolidating personal liabilities for efficiency. They never said anything openly illegal or openly threatening. They were too intelligent for that. They floated, suggested, implied, measured reactions. Andrew grew visibly more alert. He changed our home security passcode and added cameras covering the driveway and side yard. When I asked if that was excessive, he said, "I don't know yet. I'd rather be early than late." I told myself he was being protective.
Part of me was relieved.
Another part of me felt ashamed that my own husband seemed more willing to name danger than I was. One Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from my mother asking if Sadie could spend Saturday at their house because she misses her grandparents. It was phrased lightly, but Mom almost never requested one-on-one time with Sadie without a larger family setting around it. "I'll think about it," I said. Mom went quiet for half a second too long. "There's nothing to think about. We're her grandparents." I said I'll think about it. Her voice cooled. "Andrew is influencing you."
No.
"I'm her mother." That ended the call quickly. When Andrew got home, I told him. He didn't even pretend to consider it.
No.
"I know." He set his keys down. "Julia, listen to me. Your father, and that consultant are pushing around structures tied to Sadie. They are now separately asking for access to Sadie. That's not random. I know, I repeated, but this time the words came out weaker. He stepped closer. Do you? The question hurt because it was fair. The humiliation came in public, exactly where people like my parents prefer it. Not in the form of screaming. In the form of polished cruelty delivered where everyone can hear it and no one can quite call it abuse. It happened at my cousin Rebecca's engagement dinner, held at a private dining room in a downtown restaurant with too much glass and too little warmth. Our extended family was there, along with family friends and a few business acquaintances. My mother loved these mixed events because they let her manage social hierarchy in real time. Andrew came with me, and Sadie stayed with our neighbor, Mrs. Turner, who adored her and always kept crayons in a kitchen drawer just in case. The dinner started pleasantly enough.
Toasts, wine, laughter.
Then, midway through the main course, conversation turned toward property markets, business loans, and tightening credit conditions. Someone asked Dad whether family firms were more protected in volatile cycles. He smiled and gave a long answer that sounded wise without giving away anything useful. Then my aunt asked me, Julia, are you still doing legal review work from home? Before I could answer, my mother said, she tries to keep busy.
People smiled politely.
I said, yes, I still consult. Mom dabbed her mouth with her napkin. Though honestly, I've told her this is the season to focus on her child instead of proving she can still compete in rooms she left. The table went very quiet in that painful way polite tables do. I looked at her. I'm not trying to prove anything. Dad cut in smoothly. Your mother means that priorities change. Andrew said, calm but firm. Julia's work is excellent, and she manages both very well. Mom gave him a practiced smile. That's kind of you to say. It was the kind of sentence that sounds gracious unless you know it really means thank you for speaking outside your lane. Then Dad turned to a family friend across the table and said, with a little laugh, Julia has always been brilliant, but brilliance without discipline can become suspicion. She sees traps where there are spreadsheets. A few people chuckled because they thought he was making a harmless joke. My face went hot. I said quietly, that's not funny. Dad looked at me as if I were embarrassing him. Then don't make it true. Andrew set down his fork. Richard. My father ignored him. You've become very reactive lately, Julia. It's concerning. That word. Concerning. So clean.
So deadly.
I felt every eye at the table shift toward me, trying not to stare while absolutely staring. My chest tightened so badly, I could barely inhale. Mom sighed softly. Maybe we shouldn't discuss serious matters when she's tired. There it was again. I was not being attacked. I was tired, emotional, sensitive, concerning. That was how competent people destroy you. They don't call you crazy. They build a nicer word and let everyone else step into it. I stood up, so suddenly my chair scraped hard against the floor. I need some air, I said. Andrew stood too. I'm coming with you. Out in the hallway near the restrooms, I pressed my palm against the wall and tried to breathe. Andrew said, look at me. I'm fine. No, you're not. I laughed once, but it broke halfway through and turned into something close to a sob. I hate that they can still do this to me. He moved closer. Then stop giving them private access to your self-doubt. Your father wants you disoriented. That sounds paranoid.
No, he said.
It sounds strategic. When we got home that night, Sadie was asleep on our couch with a blanket tucked around her by Mrs. Turner. She looked so small and peaceful that I had to turn away for a second. After carrying her upstairs, I came back down and found Andrew standing in the kitchen, staring at his phone. What is it? He handed it to me. It was an email forwarded from one of his project subcontractors, a man Andrew trusted and had known for years. The subject line was odd. Quick heads up. The message said that someone from a financial office connected to Hart Financial had discreetly asked whether Andrew's firm was under any cash flow strain and whether he had recently sought personal guarantees for worksite lines. The subcontractor hadn't given them anything, but he thought Andrew should know. My hands started shaking. They're asking about our finances behind our backs, I said. Andrew's jaw tightened. And they're doing it through side channels. Why? He looked me dead in the eye. Because your father is building leverage. I sat down slowly. The next morning, I called Dad. I should tell you something about my father. He never raised his voice first when he was guilty. He became almost charming. That was how he bought time. When he answered, he sounded relaxed. Morning, sweetheart. I skipped everything polite. Why is someone from your office asking around about Andrew's business finances? A pause. Then, I have no idea what you're talking about. I almost believed him for a second, just out of old reflex. We have the message, I said. Dad sighed, as if I were exhausting. Julia, successful people talk. If someone made an inquiry, maybe they were trying to help. By checking whether my husband is vulnerable? You hear hostility in everything. There it is, I said quietly. There is what? The part where I bring up a factual issue, and you make my reaction the problem. He gave a short laugh. You've been reading too many therapy quotes online. I closed my eyes. Listen to me carefully, he said, voice hardening slightly. You are not equipped to interpret larger financial strategy, and Andrew is not equipped to protect you from consequences he doesn't understand. Stop creating drama around ordinary caution. Ordinary caution. That was his phrase for interference. I'm done with this conversation, I said. Julia. No. I hung up. My heart pounded so hard afterward that I had to sit with both feet flat on the floor until the room stopped tilting. That afternoon, I drove to a small records office where one of my former colleagues, a detail-obsessed woman named Laura Bennett, no, not Bennett, can't use band. Let's use Laura Pierce, now worked in private trust administration support. I trusted her because she didn't impress easily and because she disliked my father in the polite, professional way only certain lawyers do. Over coffee in a quiet side cafe, I gave her a general version of what I had seen without handing over anything too sensitive. Laura listened carefully, then said, if Richard Hart is touching contingent beneficiary pathways tied to a minor, he's not improvising. He's under pressure or he sees an opportunity. Could he do anything without direct signatures? Not cleanly. But people don't always need clean. They need confusion, timing, and a family member who signs something under stress. That sentence sat inside me like ice. Could a spouse's financial strain be used to manufacture urgency? I asked. Laura didn't soften her answer. Absolutely. I drove home with that sentence repeating in my head. A family member who signs something under stress. When I got home, I found Sadie in the backyard drawing with sidewalk chalk while Andrew took a work call on the patio. She looked up and yelled, Mommy, I made a rainbow road. I smiled so quickly it hurt. That's beautiful. Then I saw an envelope wedged into the front door frame. No stamp. Hand-delivered. Inside was a dinner invitation from my parents for the following Friday. Family only. Important discussion. Please don't be late. Andrew came in from the patio and saw my face. What now? I handed him the card. He read it once and said, We don't go. I wanted to agree immediately. Instead, I heard myself say, If we don't go, they'll escalate. Andrew looked at me for a long second. Julia, they're already escalating. He was right. I knew he was right. But there is a phase in every family disaster where refusing the invitation feels bigger than the danger itself, because refusing means admitting the danger is real. Friday came anyway. We arranged for Mrs. Turner to keep Sadie overnight because the dinner was supposed to be adults only. At noon, my mother called and said, in a strangely bright tone, Bring Sadie after dessert if you want. Your father bought that dollhouse she liked. Something about that made me say no immediately. Mom's tone chilled. You don't need to act suspicious over every kindness. I hung up without answering. At dinner, the table was set for 4. Me, Andrew, Mom, Dad. No guests. No buffer. That should have told me enough. For the first 20 minutes, conversation stayed weirdly normal. Wine. Weather. Some city rezoning story. Then Dad pushed a folder across the table.
There's an opportunity, he said.
I didn't touch it. Andrew said. What kind of opportunity? Dad leaned back. A short-term credit facility tied to an acquisition cycle. Sensible upside. Temporary risk. That tells me nothing, Andrew said. Mom smiled tightly. You always were suspicious of success. Andrew didn't even look at her. And you always answer questions with insults. I felt a flash of pride even in that room. Dad opened the folder himself. A property-backed bridge structure. I need a family-aligned guarantee path that can move quickly. I looked at the signature tabs. My name, Andrew's name, 3 affiliated entities, and language that was far too broad for a temporary guarantee. I turned pages faster. Then I saw the embedded cross-reference. Cedar Hollow again. I looked up. Absolutely not. Dad's expression didn't change. You haven't heard the full explanation. I don't need the full explanation. You're trying to drag protected structures into exposure pathways through layered guarantees. Mom let out a tired little breath. There she goes with the dramatic language again. I ignored her. This is not temporary. This is a capture mechanism. Dad's eyes sharpened. Watch your tone.
No.
Watch your paperwork. For a second, nobody moved. Then Dad said very calmly, You're going to sign. Andrew laughed once, without humor.
No, she isn't.
Dad turned to him. This is family business. Andrew replied, That stopped being true when you started circling our daughter's future interests. Mom slammed her hand lightly onto the table. Not enough to make noise for the neighbors, just enough to signal loss of patience. Do not make accusations in this house. I stood up. We're leaving. Dad said, Sit down. I didn't. Andrew rose beside me. Come on. We made it to the foyer before Dad's voice followed us. If you walk out on this, don't expect protection when things get difficult. I turned around. Protection from what? He smiled. That was worse than if he had shouted. On the drive home, Andrew said, That was a threat. I stared straight ahead. I know. What aren't you telling me? I turned to him. Nothing. But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't fully true. I hadn't told him how afraid I had become of the way my father smiled when he lost control. I hadn't told him that some deep part of me still believed refusing him might trigger a kind of punishment I didn't yet understand. Over the next 10 days, our lives began to tilt. A funding delay hit one of Andrew's mid-sized projects because an expected draw got slowed by additional lender review. A client of mine unexpectedly postponed a contract after someone quietly raised concerns about possible conflict issues connected to my family name. A school enrichment program we had already paid for Sadie suddenly called to say there had been confusion around emergency contact documentation and they needed it resubmitted because apparently grandfather Richard Hart had attempted to clarify pickup authority. That last one made me feel physically sick. Andrew drove to the school with me. The director, embarrassed and apologetic, confirmed that my father had not been granted anything, but he had spoken with enough authority that staff had briefly assumed he was entitled to update records. In the car afterward, Andrew gripped the steering wheel so tightly his hands whitened. We cut access now. We already barely give access. That's not enough. He was right again. That night, we changed every school and medical authorization, added passwords, updated emergency contact lists, and sent formal notices to any institution connected to Sadie's care that no changes could be made without direct written confirmation from both parents. As we worked through the list, I kept feeling this horrible mix of clarity and shame. Clarity, because the pattern was undeniable. Shame, because I had waited until there was movement around my child before fully accepting what kind of game my father was playing. A week later, I got the call that changed everything. My mother sounded breathless. Your father collapsed in his office. I stood up so fast, I nearly knocked over my chair. What? He's conscious now, but they think it might be stress-related. He keeps asking for you. I should tell you that my father had never been frail a day in his life. Not once. The idea of him collapsing was almost impossible to picture. Andrew, hearing my side of the conversation, mouthed, Don't go alone. I nodded. At the hospital. Dad looked pale, but not broken.
Tubes.
Monitors. The whole scene was believable enough to disarm me, but not enough to erase caution. Mom stood by the window in a cream coat that somehow still looked pressed, as if even panic had to be styled correctly in our family. "Julia," she said softly. "Thank God." Dad held out his hand weakly. "Sweetheart." My instincts split down the middle. One half was daughter. The other half was mother. I stepped closer, but didn't take his hand. "What happened?" I asked. "Pressure," he said. "Too much all at once." Mom looked at me in a way that told me blame was already loading in the chamber. This family has been under terrible strain. Andrew stayed near the door, saying almost nothing. Dad swallowed and said, "I need to make sure things are stabilized." My whole body tensed. "What things?" Andrew asked. Dad ignored him. "There are documents, Julia. Practical documents. If something happens to me, delays could destroy years of work. People depend on me."
"There are lawyers for that," I said.
"Lawyers create lag." "No," Andrew said from behind me. "They create records." Dad's jaw tightened for the first time. Then Mom stepped in with that soft, deadly voice. "Must every crisis become a battle with you two?" I looked around the room. There was a leather portfolio on the side table. I don't know if I was becoming smarter or simply more damaged by then, but I didn't move toward it. Neither did Andrew. Dad saw me notice it. "Not today," he said quickly. "I'm too tired." That was when I knew. This was not about health. This was about stage setting. On the way home, Andrew said, "If that man was dying, he wouldn't be trying to manage timing. He'd be managing succession." "I know. Do you?" I looked at him. "Stop asking me that. Then stop giving me reasons to." I turned toward the window because I didn't trust myself to speak without crying. 2 mornings later, my mother called again. "Your father has been discharged," she said. "He wants a quiet family meeting at the house. No drama. No outsiders." "Andrew is not an outsider."
A pause.
"Bring Sadie. Your father wants to see her." Ice moved through me.
"No."
"Julia."
"No."
Mom's voice became almost silky. "You are making this uglier than it needs to be." I hung up. 10 minutes later, Dad himself called. I almost let it ring out. Then I answered. "Be at the house at 6, he said.
"No."
Silence. Then, very quietly, "You don't understand how exposed your husband is." I felt my spine go rigid. "What did you do?" "I'm trying to protect this family from a chain reaction. You are making that difficult." "I'm not coming without Andrew. Bring whoever you want." That sudden agreement was wrong. I told Andrew everything, and he wanted to refuse outright. But by then we had enough moving pieces around us. Project delays, school contact interference, indirect financial pressure, that we both feared what would happen if we completely broke contact without first understanding how far my father had gone. So we prepared. Andrew backed up our home camera files. I printed the Cedar Hollow memo and another timeline summary of everything that had happened so far. I placed copies in 2 separate sealed envelopes. One stayed in my office drawer. The other went into Andrew's locked bag. I also texted Laura Pierce a simple message. "If I send, need records now. Please call me immediately and preserve everything we discussed." She replied in under a minute. Understood. At 5:30 that evening, just before we were meant to leave, Mrs. Turner called. "Julia, honey, is Sadie supposed to be with your mother tonight?" My blood ran cold.
"What?"
"She said there was a change of plans and she'd come get Sadie from my place in an hour, but something about it felt odd, so I called first." I gripped the counter so hard it hurt. "Do not let anyone near my daughter. We're coming now." Andrew had already grabbed his keys. We drove to Mrs. Turner's house first, collected Sadie, and brought her with us, because at that point the safest place felt like wherever both of us were. I hated that decision even as we made it, but the thought of leaving her anywhere my parents might reach made me sicker. By the time we pulled into my parents' driveway, the sky had gone dark blue, and the porch lights were on. The house looked beautiful, calm, expensive. A lie in brick form. Inside, Mom's face changed the second she saw Sadie. I told you this was an adult conversation. I held my daughter tighter against my side. Funny, since you tried to collect her through our neighbor without my permission. Mom's mouth flattened. That was a misunderstanding. Everything is a misunderstanding with you people, Andrew said. Dad appeared from the study doorway, looking perfectly healthy. No hospital weakness. No trembling recovery. His color was back. His posture was exact. And in that moment, something inside me finally snapped clean. The performance was over. He looked at Sadie, then at me. Come into the study. No, I said. His gaze hardened.
Now.
Andrew stepped slightly in front of us. You can say whatever you need to say right here. Dad smiled without warmth. I don't think so. Then he reached inside the open drawer of the hallway console table beside him, and everything in the world seemed to stop moving at once. When his hand came back out, there was a gun in it. Not waved wildly. Not held by a fool. Held steadily by a man who had already thought through exactly what this would do to everyone in the room. My mother gasped but didn't scream. That terrified me almost as much as the gun itself. Dad lifted it and pointed it directly at my 4-year-old daughter's head. Sadie froze against me. I couldn't breathe. Andrew said, low and deadly, Richard. Dad's voice was terrifyingly calm. Take her into the study, Julia, he said. Sit down. And sign the loan papers. My knees nearly gave out. That was the moment my whole life split into before and after. Recap, my father, Richard Hart, had been quietly building legal and financial pressure around my husband and me while testing access to my 4-year-old daughter, Sadie. After a fake health scare, manipulated meetings, and growing threats tied to trust assets connected to my child, everything exploded when he pointed a gun at Sadie in his study and ordered me to sign loan papers. I have replayed that moment in my head more times than I can count, and every time I remember the same awful detail first. My father's hand was completely steady. That was what made it real. Not the gun itself, though that would have been enough. Not my mother's silence, though that still wakes me up sometimes. It was the steadiness in his wrist, the cold control in his face, the way he looked less like a panicked man losing control and more like a man forcing a decision he had already decided he was entitled to make. Sadie pressed herself into my side, so hard her little fingers dug into my arm. I could feel her trembling through her sweater. I said the only thing my body could get out. Please. Andrew moved half a step, very slowly, and I knew he was calculating distance, angle, timing, every possible way to protect Sadie without getting her hurt. Dad noticed. Don't. That one word stopped the room again. His eyes never left Andrew's face. You're intelligent enough to understand that I am not making a dramatic point. If you move toward me, your wife may spend the rest of her life remembering exactly what that choice cost her. I felt sick so fast it was almost dizzying. Andrew lifted one hand slightly, palms visible. Take the gun off my daughter. Dad replied, then your wife can sign. My mother stood near the hallway table, her face pale but disturbingly composed. Richard, she said softly, this has gone far enough. But she didn't rush him. She didn't call the police. She didn't throw herself between that weapon and my child. She said his name the way people do, when they're trying to preserve a room, not save a life. I looked at her and understood something in a way I never had before. She had not planned this exact image, maybe, but she had walked beside everything that led to it. She had watched him pressure, isolate, and corner us, and at every stage she had called it concern, family duty, misunderstanding, strain. Her silence in that hallway was not helplessness. It was alignment. Dad tilted the gun slightly. In the study. Now. I wanted to say no. I wanted to grab Sadie and run. But the distance to the front door suddenly looked impossible, and my father was not a stupid man. He had positioned himself where he could see all of us and still force the room toward the study entrance. He knew exactly how fear rearranged people. Andrew said, very carefully, Julia, do what he says for now. That nearly broke me, because I could hear what he was really saying. Stay alive first. Think second. I nodded once, though I could barely feel my neck move. Then I bent slightly towards Sadie and whispered, baby, stay with mommy. Don't look over there.
Just hold on to me.
Her voice came out tiny and shaking. I'm scared. I know, I whispered. I know. I'm right here.
We moved into the study one slow step at a time.
Dad came in behind us. Mom followed, then Andrew. The room smelled like old leather, cedar, and whatever expensive cologne my father had worn for 20 years. The desk lamp was on. A leather portfolio sat open on the desk. Signature tabs marked several places. He had planned this carefully. Of course he had.
Sit, Dad said.
I sat in one of the chairs facing the desk, pulling Sadie into my lap. Andrew remained standing at my shoulder until Dad angled the gun toward him and said, "Back." Andrew took 2 measured steps away, but kept himself positioned where he could still see us clearly. Dad placed a packet in front of me. Sign every marked page. I stared at the paper without reading. My vision kept blurring. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the pages steady. Read it aloud, Andrew said. Dad laughed once. This is not a negotiation. Andrew's voice dropped lower. If you want a signature to survive scrutiny later, coercion this obvious is already poison. For the first time, a flicker of irritation moved across my father's face. You are under the mistaken impression that later matters more than now. That sentence chilled me. I forced myself to look down at the documents. Broad guarantee language. Multiple affiliated entities. Layered debt assumption triggers. Emergency authority clauses. And there, buried where a panicked signer might miss it, were cross-default mechanics that could tie failure under one structure to pressure under others. It was a trap exactly as I had feared. Not a bridge. A capture. A terrible, cold clarity came over me. He didn't just want liquidity. He wanted legal leverage over me and Andrew large enough to break us, and he wanted pathways touching future trust-related structures that could make Sadie's protected line part of a larger crisis narrative. My voice barely worked. This won't hold. Dad's eyes were flat. You are in no position to advise on enforceability. You put a gun on a child. He took 1 step closer. Then sign quickly. Andrew said, Richard, if this was only about money, you would never have crossed into this room with that weapon. So, let's stop pretending. What are you trying to prevent? My father looked at him with open dislike now. Consequences. For what? Andrew said. Dad didn't answer. And that was when I understood the timing. Not just pressure. Not just greed. He was covering something that had already gone too far. Something unstable enough that if one piece failed, other pieces would fall after it. This wasn't about building power anymore. It was about stopping collapse. I swallowed hard and made myself do something simple. I let one hand slip gently to Sadie's side, beneath the fabric of her cardigan, and felt the small rounded shape clipped inside. A children's GPS tag. 2 weeks earlier, after the school contact mess, Andrew had attached a small tracker inside a few of Sadie's jackets and bags. Quietly. Just in case. That wasn't enough to save us in that second, but the reminder did something important. It reminded me that I wasn't the only one thinking ahead. Dad saw my hand move and barked, both hands visible. I lifted them immediately. Then Sadie, in the clear, confused honesty only little children have, whispered, Mommy, my bunny camera hurts. The room changed. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But it changed. I felt Andrew's head turn almost imperceptibly toward Sadie. My father frowned. What did she say? I looked down at my daughter. She was squeezing the plush rabbit keychain attached to the zipper of her little bag. We had bought it at an airport gift shop months earlier. I almost answered automatically, then stopped, because suddenly I remembered. 3 days before, while Andrew had been replacing batteries in a motion sensor and sorting emergency supplies, he had shown me a tiny audio backup device no bigger than a charm and said almost casually, I'm putting this in Sadie's bag too. Not because I expect to use it. Because I want options. I had forgotten. Not because it wasn't important, but because too many terrifying things had happened since then. Sadie had called it her bunny camera because it had a tiny little eye shaped on it. Andrew spoke evenly. Sadie, sweetheart, is your bunny with you? She nodded against my shoulder. Uh-huh. Dad's expression sharpened. What is he talking about? Andrew looked straight at him. You tell me. How confident are you right now? For the first time that night, uncertainty flashed across my father's face. He snapped the gun a fraction higher. Do not test me. But the room no longer belonged entirely to him. Not after that. My mother's eyes moved to Sadie's bag. Richard, he hissed, be quiet. Andrew took a slow breath. You invited us here after calling in false pickup authority on our daughter, after pressuring trust-link structures, after interfering with my business, after staging a health crisis, and now you've pointed a gun at a child while forcing a signature. Even you know that if one clean record of this leaves the room, you are finished. My father said nothing. That silence told me more than any confession. He was thinking, calculating odds, distance to the bag, whether he could seize it, whether he had already said too much, whether the audio was active, whether bluffing mattered. Then he did something I will never forget. He smiled at me again. Julia, he said almost gently, you know how narratives work. One frightened family argument can look like many things. A child's confused words can sound like anything. A recording without context can be shaped. My skin crawled. He was still trying to sell reality as a formatting problem. Andrew said, keep talking. Dad ignored him. His gaze stayed on me. You have two choices. Sign, and I contain this. Or refuse, and I let the next month teach you what exposure feels like. He meant Andrew's projects. My contracts. Smears. Delays. Maybe worse. My heart was hammering so badly, I could hear it in my ears. But under the fear, something else had finally arrived. Anger. Not hot, uncontrolled anger. Cold anger. The kind that straightens your spine after months of being bent. I looked at the gun, then at him. You can ruin my finances, I said. You can try to ruin my name. But if you think I will help you build a legal structure on top of my daughter after this, then for the first time in your life, you've misjudged me. My mother made a small sound, almost like disbelief. Dad's face hardened. Sign. No. He stepped forward again. And then Andrew moved. Not toward the gun. Toward the side table lamp. He knocked it hard with his forearm, sending it crashing between my father and the desk. The room jerked in chaos for a split second. The bulb burst with a sharp pop. My mother screamed, Sadie cried out, and Andrew lunged low, driving a shoulder into my father's midsection just as the gun arm jerked offline. I don't know whether the weapon discharged or just struck the desk. I heard a violent metallic crack, and then everything became noise and motion. I curled around Sadie and dropped sideways out of the chair, pulling her under me. Papers scattered. My mother was shouting. My father and Andrew crashed into the corner of the desk hard enough to shake the shelves. Then I heard Andrew yell, Julia, phone. I crawled, half dragging Sadie, toward my handbag on the floor by the chair. My fingers were numb. I fumbled the zipper twice before getting my phone free and hitting emergency call with shaking hands. The operator answered, and I said words I never imagined I would say about my own family. My father has a gun. He pointed it at my daughter. Send police now. Send them now. I gave the address, choking on every other word. Across the room, Andrew had both hands locked around my father's wrist, pinning the gun arm against the edge of the desk while trying to keep the barrel away from everyone. Dad was stronger than he looked and frighteningly focused even in the struggle. My mother kept shouting Richard's name like the sound itself might reverse what he had done. Then Dad made his real mistake. He looked at me, not at Andrew, who was physically fighting him, at me, and he yelled, You stupid girl, you were supposed to protect this family. That sentence hit me like a slap from 15 different years at once. Not love, not regret, not fear for Sadie, not shame. His outrage was that I had failed to protect him. Police arrived fast, much faster than I expected. Maybe because the address carried weight. Maybe because the word child changes everything. Maybe because God was still merciful in moments when I thought my life had already split open too far to be held together. The first officers entered with weapons drawn and voices sharp, controlled, commanding. Andrew released only when they had physical control of my father's arm, and the gun was secured. I kept holding Sadie on the floor until one of the officers crouched and said, "Ma'am, I need you to come with me now." My legs barely worked. My father, pinned and furious, still looked more insulted than terrified. He said, "This is a family misunderstanding." One officer replied, "Not tonight it isn't. I should tell you that the next few hours passed in pieces."
Statements.
Paramedics checking Sadie and Andrew. A female officer bringing my daughter juice. She was too shaken to drink. My mother crying in elegant, restrained bursts that made her look heartbreakingly dignified if you didn't know what you were looking at. Me repeating facts over and over until words lost meaning.
Gun. Child.
Papers.
Threats.
Loan documents. Prior interference.
School.
Trust structure. Consultant. Health scare.
Pressure.
I also remembered, somewhere in that blur, to take Sadie's bag and hand the bunny device to an officer. My fingers shook so hard I nearly dropped it. "This may have audio," I said. The officer's expression changed instantly. He put it into an evidence pouch without another word. Around 2 in the morning, after Sadie had finally fallen asleep against my shoulder in a family services room at the station, Andrew sat beside me with a bruise already darkening across his jaw. He said quietly, "We're done protecting them." I turned to him, exhausted beyond tears. I think that part of me died tonight. He took my hand.
"No," he said.
"The part of you that kept confusing loyalty with safety died. That's different." I leaned into him then, just for a second, because I needed some part of the world to feel solid. The next morning, our lives changed in ways that felt both immediate and delayed. Immediate, because there were already restrictions, reports, and emergency protective steps in motion around Sadie and us. Delayed, because men like my father do not fall apart in one night. They have structures. Lawyers. Allies. Accountants. Old favors. Polite defenders. People who say things like there must be more to the story. And there was. By noon, Gregory Shaw had tried to contact me twice. I didn't answer. Laura Pierce called instead. "I heard enough to know this isn't salvageable," she said. "Do you want me to start pulling every historical record tied to Cedar Hollow and related heart entities?" "Yes," I said immediately.
"Good.
Do not speak casually to anyone from the company, not even to deny anything." "And Julia?" "Yes. If your father was willing to use a weapon in a coercive signing attempt, then the paper trail behind that desperation is going to be ugly." She was right. We moved out of our house that same week, temporarily, not because it was legally necessary, but because Andrew and I no longer trusted normal routines. A close friend of his, Daniel Mercer, owned a furnished townhouse in another part of the city and let us stay there quietly while legal and security issues were sorted out. The place was smaller than our home and much plainer than the house I had grown up in, but the first night there, after locking the door and seeing Sadie asleep in a room whose windows I had checked 3 times myself, I felt something I had not felt in months. Relief. Not peace yet, but relief. Rock bottom is strange. It does not always look like collapse from the outside. Sometimes it looks like sitting on the floor of a borrowed kitchen at 6 in the morning because your child finally slept and your husband is meeting with lawyers and you are holding a mug of coffee gone cold and realizing your entire old life was built around accommodating people who would have sacrificed you without blinking. That was where I was when I made the next decision. I called a woman named Dr. Naomi Ellis. Years earlier, after Sadie was born, Naomi had become my doctor during a difficult postpartum recovery period. She was calm, exact, and not easily manipulated by social status. More than once, she had gently challenged things I brushed aside. After the dinner humiliation and then the trust issue, I had thought about calling her, not because she was involved in finance, but because she was one of the few professionals in my life who never let polished people hide behind polished language. When I explained, in broad terms, that there had been escalating family pressure, psychological manipulation, and a violent coercive event involving my child, she did not overreact. She did something more useful. She said, "I want you evaluated for acute stress response, and I want documentation created now. while your memory is close. Not because you are unstable, because people like that often try to say you are. That sentence hit me right in the chest. By the following afternoon, I had formal medical documentation of trauma symptoms consistent with recent violent coercion, and more importantly, clear notes stating that I was oriented, coherent, and able to recount events in organized detail. It seems like a small thing, maybe, until you grow up with people who have spent a lifetime planting the idea that you are too emotional to be trusted. At the same time, Andrew and I met with an attorney named Rebecca Sloan, recommended through Laura. Rebecca was exactly the kind of lawyer my father hated most. Not loud, not theatrical, not intimidated, and impossible to distract with status. She spread our notes, copies, timelines, trust memos, school records, email screenshots, and institution contact logs across a long conference table and said, "Your father's biggest vulnerability is not the gun. It's the pattern." I blinked at her. "Not the gun." "Oh, the gun is catastrophic," she said evenly. "But wealthy, disciplined people sometimes think one event can be explained as emotional collapse, family conflict, medication, stress, anything. Patterns are harder. The false pickup attempt, the side-channel financial inquiries, the staged medical urgency, the trust-linked pressure, the loan documents drafted with embedded exposure, the consultant involvement. That becomes intent." I looked at Andrew. He was already there mentally. I was still catching up. Rebecca continued, "And if we can connect his desperation to undisclosed commercial instability or improper use of affiliated entities, then this moves from family horror into institutional risk." Institutional risk. That was a language my father had built his life on. Lenders, boards, committees, insurers, firms. He had always believed those systems protected men like him because he knew how to sound respectable inside them. For the first time, I saw a path where those same systems could become the place he lost control. The truth began unfolding in layers after that. Laura uncovered internal filing irregularities around affiliated heart entities that had been moving debt exposure in circles to make several obligations look cleaner than they were. Gregory Shaw's consulting role was much deeper than my father had implied. He had helped design timing structures around distressed assets and short-term liquidity masks. On paper, none of it shouted criminality in giant letters. But together, it suggested something dangerous, a man using complex restructuring maneuvers to keep lenders calm while searching for fresh collateral confidence and emergency leverage. And because direct access to the protected line through Cedar Hollow was legally blocked, he had apparently been exploring indirect coercive pathways through me. Through my signature. Through panic. Through family. When Rebecca explained that to me in plain English, I felt both vindicated and physically ill. So, he wanted me to sign because he thought if enough obligations were layered around us, future pressure points connected to Sadie's line could be leveraged indirectly? Rebecca nodded. "That is my working theory, yes." I sat there in stunned silence. All those years of being told I was dramatic. All those dinners. All those polished corrections. And underneath it, my father had been looking at my daughter, not as a child, but as structural value. I went to the restroom after that meeting and cried harder than I had cried the night of the gun. Not because I doubted myself anymore. Because I didn't. That was somehow worse. The rebuilding of my life started in quiet ways. Sadie began drawing again, without leaving the page halfway through. That mattered to me more than almost anything. She stopped waking up screaming every night and shifted to only some nights. That also mattered. Andrew and I learned to speak in shorter, clearer sentences because both of us were tired in the bones. I resumed a small amount of contract review work for one client completely unrelated to my family network. Daniel connected Andrew to a developer who respected his work enough to keep him moving while one delayed project untangled. Little by little, our days became less about shock and more about structure. But beneath that, we were preparing. We collected everything. Not just the big, obvious things. Everything. School records showing my father's attempted pickup authority interference. The subcontractor email about side-channel questions into Andrew's finances. My call logs with mom and dad. The hospital timeline around the fake health scare. Security footage from our home showing dates and times connected to meetings and unusual drop-offs. The printed cedar hollow memo from my grandfather's estate file. My written notes from hearing Dad and Gregory in the study. Medical documentation of acute trauma. The bunny device audio. Every page of the loan package recovered from the study after police involvement. And then there was the audio itself. I did not listen to it first. Andrew did, with Rebecca present. He came home with a face I knew instantly.
Worse.
Tell me, I said. He sat across from me at the townhouse kitchen table and said carefully, "It caught the whole thing." I felt my hands go cold. How much? Enough. I swallowed. Everything. Almost everything from the study onward. The demands. The pressure. You refusing. Richard threatening consequences. The struggle. You calling emergency. I closed my eyes. There are truths you want and truths you dread, and sometimes they are the same truth. Weeks passed. My father's legal team shifted posture multiple times. At first they implied misunderstanding and emotional strain. Then they tried procedural caution. Then they quietly pushed a narrative that he had suffered a temporary medication-related episode following a hospital discharge. It might even have worked on some people if the whole case were just one isolated scene. But it wasn't. The pattern was there. And while my father had spent decades building his image through private rooms and expensive institutions, he had forgotten something basic. Intelligent people still panic when proof becomes portable. The public climax came sooner than anyone in my family expected. Hart Financial had an emergency lender and board review scheduled at a downtown conference center 6 weeks after the gun incident. Under ordinary circumstances, I would never have been anywhere near that room. But by then, several things had shifted. Insurers were nervous. Lenders had questions. Internal confidence had cracks in it. Gregory Shaw had stopped appearing publicly with my father. And Rebecca, working with cooperating counsel and formal requests already in motion, believed the review meeting would be the first place where several masks would fail at once. I was not there to grandstand. I was there because my name, my signatures, my child's future interests, and my father's coercive attempt were all now connected to questions those people could no longer avoid. The conference room was large, cold, and corporate in that intentional way meant to keep emotion out. Glass wall, long table, coffee that tasted expensive and empty. Men and women in dark suits, neat binders, cautious eyes. Dad was already there when Andrew and I entered with Rebecca. He looked at me once and went still. Not shocked exactly. More irritated that I had arrived in a room he still thought of as his. My mother was not present. Gregory was not present. But several board members were, along with outside counsel, lender representatives, a compliance officer, and a risk specialist whose name I never forgot because she ended up being one of the first people to look truly horrified. Her name was Melissa Grant. Melissa began by summarizing urgent concerns regarding disclosure integrity, collateral representations, affiliated exposure pathways, and recent conduct matters potentially affecting institutional trust. Corporate language. Bloodless, on the surface. But underneath it, I could hear the floor cracking. My father interrupted twice in the first 10 minutes, both times trying to reframe the issue as a personal family conflict spilling into business review. That might have worked once. It did not work now, because Rebecca didn't argue emotionally. She placed a clean chronology on the table. School interference, financial pressure attempts, staged health urgency, coercive signing packet, protected trust link structures, police response, audio evidence,
Pattern.
Then she placed the cedar hollow summary memo beside it. Then the annotated loan packet. Then the contact logs. Then the medical documentation establishing that I had reported the event coherently and immediately. Finally, outside counsel announced that portions of the audio had been authenticated for review. That was the moment my father's color changed. Not completely. Not dramatically. Men like him don't go theatrical unless they are cornered beyond language. But I watched the blood leave his face in a slow, unmistakable wave. He looked at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw real fear. One lender representative asked, "Is it your position, Mr. Hart, that this audio is fabricated?" Dad opened his mouth.
Closed it. Try it again.
It is a distorted fragment of a deeply emotional family event. Melissa Grant asked, a family event involving a firearm directed at a minor while loan papers were being presented? No one moved. My father said, I was not in a stable state. Rebecca replied before anyone else could. That explanation does not account for the pre-existing document structure, prior leverage behavior, attempted access to the child through third parties, hospital-timed urgency, or consultant-linked debt positioning. Silence hit the room, so hard it almost felt physical. Andrew sat beside me, steady and unreadable. I kept my hands folded in my lap, because if I let myself feel too much in that moment, I might shake. One board member, an older man who had probably spent years admiring my father's numbers, said quietly, Richard, did you attempt to obtain a signature from your daughter under threat tied to these instruments? My father's eyes flickered toward me again. And suddenly I understood that he still thought he might be able to manage this if he could make me look emotional enough, wounded enough, vindictive enough. He said, my daughter has been under severe psychological strain and has been influenced by parties who don't understand how families under pressure can. I cut him off. That was the first time in my life I had interrupted my father in a formal room. No, I said. My own voice surprised me.
Calm. Clean.
Not loud. Just done. You spent my whole life teaching me that respectable language could hide anything. You called fear concern. You called coercion protection. You called strategy family duty. You tried to build debt pathways around my child, pressure my husband, isolate me, then force my signature with a gun in the room. You are not confused. You are exposed. Nobody breathed for a second. Dad stared at me like I had slapped him. Then Rebecca slid one final page across the table. It was not dramatic looking. Just a formal summary connecting the protected nature of Sadie's contingent line to the attempted indirect leverage structure and the legal review risk that would have been triggered if my coerced signatures had been used to support broader exposure. Melissa Grant read it once, then looked straight at my father. I am recommending immediate suspension of all authority pending full review. A lender representative added, our institution will freeze ongoing discretionary approvals until this matter is fully investigated. Another voice from the far end said, we may need independent forensic review of all affiliated exposure disclosures. That was when the room turned. You can feel social gravity change when a powerful person stops being the center and becomes the risk. People who had spent years nodding along with my father's certainty were suddenly not looking at him for leadership anymore. They were looking at him like he might poison their own records by proximity. He tried one last time. He straightened in his chair and said, you are all making an extraordinary mistake based on a private domestic incident being weaponized by resentment. Melissa didn't even blink. No, Mr. Hart. We are responding to pattern, concealment risk, governance failure, and conduct that no institution in its right mind can ignore. That sentence was one of the most satisfying things I have ever heard in my life. Dad looked at me again. But this time there was nothing left for him to organize inside my face. No guilt. No collapse. No trained daughter trying to calm the room he had damaged.
Just me.
And the truth. For the first time, the truth stood right in the middle of all of us, and he couldn't run from it anymore. The months after that were not magically easy. I want to be honest about that. People like my father do not disappear cleanly. They leave paperwork, lawyers, whispers, old loyalties, and emotional wreckage behind them. There were hearings, reviews, protective orders, custody-related safeguards around Sadie's contact boundaries, and more than one ugly attempt by extended family to suggest I had been too harsh. Too harsh. On the man who pointed a gun at my child. That taught me another painful truth. Some people do not actually care what happened. They care whether you disrupted the family's preferred version of it. I stopped caring what those people thought. My father lost far more than one meeting. He lost operational control over the company he had spent decades shaping around himself. Multiple reviews widened. Several affiliated structures were audited. Gregory Shaw disappeared from public involvement and later had to answer his own questions from people with much less patience than mine. My father's reputation in the polished circles he loved so much did not collapse overnight, but it cracked badly enough that it never looked the same again. Invitation slowed. Trust thinned. His name, once protective, started requiring explanation. My mother stayed with him, at first. That did not surprise me. What surprised me was that, months later, I heard from an old family acquaintance that even she had begun privately distancing herself from some of his financial decisions. Not out of morality, as far as I could tell. Out of survival. As for access to Sadie, that door closed. Firmly. Not through revenge. Through boundaries. She did not owe warmth to the people who made fear part of her childhood vocabulary. She owed nothing to adults who treated her safety as negotiable. The systems around us finally understood that too. Andrew and I did not come out of it untouched, but we came out of it real. That matters. We moved into a new home the following year. Smaller than my childhood house. Smaller than the house we lost access to temporarily during the fallout. But it was ours in a way my old life had never been. No portraits of dead expectations on the wall. No rooms designed for impression more than comfort. Just quiet, sunlight, a kitchen Sadie could reach the counter in with a stool, and locks that meant safety instead of secrecy. My work changed too. I stopped circling the edges of family-connected business entirely and built a practice doing exactly the kind of review I once used to protect other people's structures without fully protecting myself. Contracts, risk language, exposure clauses, coercive financial patterns. Sometimes life is strange that way. The thing that almost destroys you becomes the thing you can finally see clearly. Andrew's business recovered more slowly, but it recovered honestly. And that honesty gave us something stronger than polish ever had. Sadie is older now. She still loves purple, though the rain boots are gone. She remembers pieces of that night in fragments, which is painful, but she also remembers something else. She remembers that her parents did not hand her over to fear and call it normal. She remembers that when the truth became ugly, we still chose it. As for me, I no longer mistake intelligence for goodness, elegance for safety, or family for trust. For a long time, I thought my biggest weakness was that I was too emotional, too soft, too slow to confront people I loved. Now I know the truth. My real weakness was that I kept trying to survive dangerous people by understanding them better, instead of accepting that some people understand you perfectly and still choose to harm you. I don't hate my father every day anymore. Hate is heavy, and I carried enough heavy things in that family. But I do see him clearly now. And once you see someone clearly, you stop building your life around their version of reality. Now, when I tuck Sadie into bed, when Andrew locks up downstairs, when the house is quiet in the safe way and not the secretive way, I sometimes think about the girl I used to be sitting at polished tables, apologizing for discomfort she didn't create. I want to reach back through time and tell her this. You were never too sensitive. You were noticing what everyone else had decided to normalize. And once I truly understood that, I stopped being the daughter they trained me to be and became the mother my child needed instead. From everything I went through, I learned that love without safety is not love, and family without boundaries can become the most dangerous trap of all. If you're in a situation like mine back then, please remember this. The moment someone asks you to sacrifice your peace, your truth, or your child's safety to protect their image, you need to stop calling that loyalty. If you've ever gone through something similar or you want to share your own story, write it in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with your friends, like the video, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.